In the black of dawn, the barn door creaks open, and there stands young Thomas Blackthorn, trembling beside three female figures whose eyes glint with terror, and his father's silhouette materializes behind them like a specter. Within 8 heartbeats, the town square fills with the clang of the church bell, and the master commands, "You shall wed them all." What you just glimpsed is not folklore. It is a buried atrocity, long erased, of a plantation in 1887 America. Tonight, we plunge into the shadows of a forgotten past. In one instant, a family, a church, and a wider community were engulfed in ritual, coercion, and secrets no official record shall ever admit. Hidden behind oak-paneled walls and hymns sung in tremulous voices, lies corruption born of power, faith, and the unimaginable. So draw in your breath. What follows is real enough to shatter quiet towns, the institutional facades, and the very foundations of what is believed to be civilized. The story of Blackthorn Manor, of Thomas and those 3 women, and of shadow histories in seminaries and orphanages, awaits. Perched atop the levee overlooking the Mississippi, Blackthorn Manor glowed white in twilight, its wide veranda columns a facade of grandeur and piety. Built in 1855 by Jonathan Blackthorn, whose family received the land through ties to the local church diocese, the house became more than a home. It was a place of worship and control. Jonathan's son, Thomas, raised in pinstriped suits, reciting the creeds of faith, was expected to inherit more than land. He inherited ideals of moral superiority. Yet beneath the veneer of magnolia blossoms and Sunday sermons, the slaves in the quarters murmured of strange rites, late-night processions, and the 3 sisters, locked in the barn. The plantation's ledger glossed over chores, threadbare clothing, and whispered complaints. The church across the road, St. Cecilia's, claimed charity, but a grizzled caretaker recalled how the parish lent its authority to the manor's demands. Institutional control haunted every space: the plantations, the church pews, the silent barn. In the spring of 1887, a secret fissure cracked, and the world changed. The mighty veranda framed a ritual that no hymnal would ever record. Their names were not recorded in any official census, only their roles: cook, gardener, seamstress. Yet in the slave quarters they spoke of themselves as sisters: Celeste, Rosamond, and Inez. Each brought from distant homes, each bearing trauma no one asked about. Celeste's hands trembled when she stirred the porridge. Rosamond awoke screaming of fire in Africa. Inez, in the seamstress room, stitched night after night, muttering of voices in the cotton bales. When Thomas discovered them in the barn, laughing, crying, the records don't agree. The event broke the brittle order of the plantation. The master's rage and twisted paternalism collided. He saw his sons act as betrayal, but the caretakers saw opportunity. In the town square, beneath the church spire, the forced wedding rendered the sisters subjects of a grotesque contract. They stood in white gowns, gifted by the church treasurer's wife, while the church bell tolled. Their eyes flicked to the crowd, the scorched barn behind them, the son who refused their names. In that moment, they were no longer healers of the plantation. They were the bride voids of a small town spectacle, conscripted by masculinity, faith, economics, and terror. On June 14, 1887, at 4 p.m., the bells of St. Cecilia's rang for the least expected marriage in town memory. The entire town of Beaumont's Landing turned out, milling in suits and bonnets, eyes guided by the church's hymnody and the plantation's announcement. The master stepped forward, his cane clicking on cobbles, and decreed, "My son shall wed these 3, to bind them into my line, to tie them to this land, to ensure the manor's future." The son, Thomas, looked gaunt, his shoulders sagging beneath the velvet coat, his voice lifeless. The 3 women stood erect, hands clasped, yet each bore an expression carved of defiance or resignation. The minutes stretched like elastic. The preacher recited verses of obedience and submission. The crowd, uncomfortable, unmoved, clapped and prayed. No church records preserve the names of the brides. After the ceremony, a hush fell. The barn loomed behind the manor, smelling of hay, sweat, and secrecy. At dusk, the townsfolk returned to their porches, unraveling the event in whispered questions. What did it mean? Was it faith? Was it power? Was it fear? They never asked too loudly again. In the weeks after the ceremony, the town fell into a brittle lull. Blackthorn Manor resumed its Sunday gatherings. The plantation slaves returned to accelerated labor. The three newly wedded women were stately in the land census, but unseen in the parlor. Thomas haunted the corridors, muttering sermons to himself. The church trustees nodded and turned the page. Yet in hidden corners, murmurs grew. The seamstress clipped cloth in darkness. The gardener plucked vines from the barn's roof. The cook smoked quietly under the hood. No official record captured this tension, no clerk filed it. The official ledger went on. Births, deaths, tithes, all pristine. But private diaries, lost in storms, spoke of shrill voices, of convent-style retreats in the attic, of bound hands in haylofts. The institutional control assumed the event would pass like a blip, but trauma doesn't vanish. It seeps. The three women began to dream of water rising, of church bells tolling at midnight, of children in the orphanage across town who cried for mother and saw none. And across the plantation, an older slave, Sarah, whispered, "They never meant for us to see." There stood the Sisters of Redemption Orphanage, a stately brick building with stained glass windows and a bell tower mirroring the churches across the bayou. Established in 1872, it was meant to uplift the fatherless, orphaned children of fallen families. But after the Blackthorn ceremony, its directors accepted children from the plantation, children sired by the unclear unions of master and slave, possibly including Thomas himself. The children arrived at twilight, escorted by carriages from the manor. Inside the orphanage, the sisters instituted strict discipline, hymns at dawn, white gowns for the girls, cropped hair for the boys. Yet the children spoke of the barn, the one behind the manor, and the three mothers who lived there but never visited. The housemistress silenced them. The children scratched names into walls, C.R.I. When asked, they shivered. Institutional control cloaked everything. The church gave grants. The manor offered donations. The townsfolk accepted the facade of virtue. But at night, the orphanage's corridors breathed with echoes of children sobbing for mothers who were bride ghosts of the town square. In bridging plantation and orphanage, the ceremony's fallout rippled beyond the wedding day, into lives shaped by trauma, by unseen mothers, by suppressed lineage. The local seminary, St. Augustine's, was built 3 miles inland and trained ministers in the language of salvation and duty. Many of its graduates served in the region, including the preacher who officiated the Blackthorn wedding. Hidden in its archives are letters. In one, a student writes of the arrangement at Blackthorn and wonders if faith justifies it. The rector replies with scripture about obedience and submission. Inside the seminary walls, doctrine merged with power. The landlords, the prelature, the slaves, the orphanage all intertwined in a network of control. The three women were taught to attend services, to serve in sewing circles, to speak mildly, while Thomas sat in the pews with a vacant gaze. But at the seminary's library, a banned text described pagan rituals in antebellum South plantations, rites of marriage not just of individuals but of estates, linking slaves into the lineage of masters through forced unions. The rector forbade discussion under penalty of expulsion, because the church did not wish its vines pruned by daylight. As the seminary sanitized the event in theology, its students suppressed the trauma in silence. In that way, institutional control became a ritual, the master's command, the church's blessing, the seminary's silence, all facets of a mechanism that bound people to land, to history, to fear. Behind Blackthorn Manor's fields, the barn stood ancient and cracked, beams wrapped in chains and rope haunches of hay. It was the site of the ceremony, the discovery, the suppression. Late at night the wind sighed through its gaps. Rats scuttled in shoals. The three women, once inside, were isolated there before the ceremony, locked in the loft until dawn, and some say they heard hidden chants, felt a cold breeze of inevitability. Some of the slaves recalled a symbol carved into the beam, a circle and cross beneath a magnolia leaf. They believed it summoned the pact linking Thomas and the three women. The barn's scent was of damp straw, of sweat and fear, of faded prayers scratched into wood by unknown hands. For decades afterward, no one entered that loft. As the years passed, the barn became an unspoken monument. Children dared each other to peer inside. Slaves avoided its shadow. Townsfolk crossed the road to keep distance. In its gloom, the past coalesced, like a breath held too long. When the barn finally collapsed in 1926 under storm weight, workers found 4 skeletons entwined, 1 male, 3 female, and carved into the floorboards. Only 3 letters remained, TCR. The signs pointed to a haunted memory no one was supposed to uncover. Thomas Blackthorn inherited the manor in 1895 after his father's sudden death in the study. He married none. His only companions were the 3 women, now seen only at Sunday service, seated at the back pew. The town whispered, "What becomes of children from that union?" There were no legitimate heirs recorded. Yet in the orphanage's records, 3 children, and signed by name, were assigned master's estate as sponsor in 1898. The 3 wives vanished almost socially. Celeste died in 1902 of fever. Rosamond died in 1907 after a fall in the barn loft. Inez disappeared in 1911, her bed left empty, her chair unoccupied. Thomas lived on until 1924, pale and small, his smile brittle. In the portrait gallery, a painting of Thomas and the 3 women remains in shadow. In the frame's corner, you can just make out the barn beam symbol. The manor fell into disrepair. Families linked to the Blackthorns sold their land. The church pews emptied. The orphanage closed. And still, the question hovers. What family is born of coercion, of forced vows, of institutional alliances? In that forced marriage, the old master bound more than flesh and land. He bound generations into silence. Families built on such lies cannot stand. They unravel in whispered sickness, in children neither acknowledged nor nurtured. In the attic of St. Cecilia's, dusty ledgers and yellowed parchments awaited rediscovery in 1953 by a janitor who died soon after. Among the documents, a revoked baptismal certificate for a daughter of Celeste and Thomas, a letter from the rector to the plantation bookkeeper instructing no mention of the wedding in public records, a ledger entry reading 3 times fiancés, estate time. Though these papers were stored, the parish never made them public. Scholars later interviewed priests who recalled rumors of an estate marriage, but they labeled the tale apocryphal. The church's institutional machinery chose forgetting. When the janitor died, the folders were shipped to incineration. What remained? Fragments, ashes, silence. The church's role was more than spiritual. It was the vehicle that legitimized the spectacle. It ordained the union, rang the bells, did the hymns, all while erasing names. In those ledgers, the missing names cried out: Celeste, Rosamond, Inez, and the child who bore their void. Institutional control meant that the doctrine of family masked the doctrine of property. The church library still holds stained hymnals from that era, the margins inked by children at the orphanage, the same children who never saw their mothers. The archive is but a skeleton of truth, the flesh long turned to dust. After the barn collapse in 1926, villagers said the manor's windows glowed at midnight, though no one lived there. Workers found the skeletons, but the authorities quietly reburied them. The event was never fully investigated. No coroner's report, no official tombstone. The 3 women vanished from the rolls. The sons and daughters of the Blackthorn estate never claimed inheritance. The trio of skeletons remained unnamed in burial. Why? Because speaking their names would collapse the carefully built narrative of the town. A dominance unchallenged, an institution unquestioned. The orphanage children who later fled spoke of a night of chains in the barn loft, but their voices passed into asylum files and were silenced. The disappearance of acknowledgement became part of the horror. Bodies existed, but names did not. Children existed, but mothers did not. The ceremony existed, but the reason did not. In memory, the barn became the place where the wind kills, a whispered phrase among youths. Institutional control extended to memory itself. The town council banned the phrase. The church council forbade sermons about the Black Wedding, and the seminary students were told the story was legend. Thus, the disappearance was orchestrated not by one man, but by an architecture of forgetting. The children raised at the orphanage, 3 who arrived in 1898 and another batch after 1905, grew into adults with odd tremors. One later confessed, "I dream of the 3 mothers in white gowns. and died at 42 of unspecified heart failure. Another, a gardener, whispered under his breath, "I heard the chains in the barn once." Trauma reached beyond the subjects. It bled into the soil of the manor, the walls of the church, the corridors of the seminary. Institutional control meant that the deliberate forgetting became its own kind of violence. The next generation never learned what had happened, but their lives spoke of it. Children unmothered, husbands who didn't marry, estates without heirs, churches whose pews emptied, orphanages whose windows stared dark. The master's legacy wasn't just the forced wedding. It was the psychic furnace that burned futures. These silent wounds festered in the nights, in the wind rustling through abandoned vines at the manor, in the bell tower that no longer rang. In the psychology of the town, a disquiet settled, unnameable. The three women, Celeste, Rosamond, Inez, became specters, not because they haunted the living, but because the living refused to name them. That refusal is the root of the true horror. In 1932, a woman named Josephine Caldwell, a former orphan of St. Cecilia's, received a battered envelope from an unknown sender. Inside were 3 letters, one in French, Celeste's, one in Portuguese, Rosamond's, and one in Spanish, Inez's. Each described hope, fear, longing for children, and dread of the ceremony that had tied them to Thomas and the land. Josephine tried to publish them, but the church intervened, the newspapers refused, and the letters disappeared. For years, they sat in a safe deposit box until the bank closed them. The language shift signaled the women's roots, their voices, articulate, defiant. Their words, the only direct trace of their existence. But the institutional archiving mechanism refused them. The black-inked letters spoke of barns and bindings, of children they would never know, of prayers unanswered. Josephine later told friends she glimpsed the manor at dusk and heard the rustle of gowns. But when she tried to return to claim the letters, she found nothing. The 3 letters, and the names they bore, vanished again, not by accident, but by systemic erasure. The church archive had the pages, the bank had them, the orphanage's basement had them, but no one would claim responsibility. They became phantoms in ink. And in that evaporation, the institutional power asserted itself. You will not know. You will not remember. What many historians refuse to acknowledge. The wedding in the town square wasn't merely a marital union. It was docking of lineage, land, property. In 19th century America, slaves could not own land, but their labor built it. Their children inherited it only through the master. By forcing Thomas to wed 3 women owned by the estate, the master created heirs who belonged to the land, physically and metaphysically. The church blessed it, the seminary taught the duty, the orphanage accepted the children. This was estate law disguised as marriage. The 3 women were vessels of continuity. The master justified it in sermons. Marriage to my son grants you freedom, connection. But the freedom was hollow. He bound them into the family line, obliterating their pasts, their identities. The barn symbolized this. Rope, chains, hay, darkness. They anchored the women and Thomas together as an asset. The town square ceremony, public, sanctified, sealed the pact. Behind the white gowns and the hymns lay the economics of slavery rebranded. The institutional structures, the church, the estate ledger, the orphanage, worked together to perpetuate control. This manor did not just harvest cotton. It harvested lineage, silence, and generational trauma. In examining the hidden architecture of land law and dominance, the event becomes not simply horrific, but profoundly structural. By 1940, Beaumont's Landing had whittled to a small hamlet. The manor had collapsed. The church had halved its congregation. The orphanage shuttered. Yet the event of 1887 was barely a whisper. The town's centennial catalog described Jonathan Blackthorn as benevolent plantation owner, omitted the wedding, omitted the skeletons. The institutional apparatus of forgetting was twofold: official documents erased and communal memory repressed. Families no longer spoke of the black wedding. Children teased one another about ghosts but had no names. Historians skipped over it as local legend. The 3 women were relegated to footnotes. The children of the orphanage drifted away. The church records glossed the baptism of Thomas's shadow children as illegitimate estate matters. The seminary lost the rector's letters. Over time, The manor's grounds returned to marsh. The barn's collapse gave birth to reeds. Yet in the mist of early mornings, locals claimed they heard a hymn emanating from the water lilies near the levee. What does that mean? That truth cannot be buried. It seeps. The town's forgetting is its own horror. By refusing to remember, it surrendered control of its soul to the very institutions that coerced it. In 1996, a historian named Dr. Marion Vale discovered a faded map in the State Archive showing Blackthorn lands, CNXC. On returning to the site with a metal detector, she unearthed fragments, a cufflink engraved T, shards of a porcelain teacup bearing a floral pattern from the orphanage, and nailheads from the collapsed barn. In the soil, she identified a faint outline of the symbol the slaves described, the circle and cross beneath a magnolia leaf. Interviews with descendants of the original slaves revealed oral traditions. "Our mothers were the three sisters," one elder said. The historian's report concluded, this was not an isolated incident. It was a convergence of family, faith, and property disguised as normalcy. The local church denied cooperation. The seminary refused records. But Dr. Vale pressed on. She found that the three sisters, Celeste, Rosamond, Inez, were not listed in any census, yet their children were. The implication, erasure by design. The remnant pieces, the cufflink, the teacup, are symbolic shards of a ritual no archive willingly holds. In that digging, one feels the bones of silence shift. The institutions built to protect, to teach, to shelter, they instead built walls around secrets. And those walls now begin to crack. What of Thomas? What of the three women? Beyond the stock ledger lies the interior life, the unvoiced dread, the coping, the fractured souls. Celeste dreams of water flooding the levee. Rosamund's panic at dusk when the church bell rang without warning. Inez's compulsion to sew gowns at midnight for children who were never hers. Thomas drifted through rooms like a specter, silencing his voice beneath the chapel arches. The trauma was generational. The orphanage children, raised without true mothers, suffered attachment disorders, nightmares of the barn, and voices whispering names they couldn't know. The church helped, counseling, prayer groups, but never asked the right questions. The seminarian social studies records show students describing the discharge of power and the ritual of compliance, but their theses were suppressed. In the end, the horror lies not only in what happened, but in how the characters lived thereafter, untouched by justice, untouched by acknowledgement. Their psyches became a repository of suppressed truths, the marriage that should not have been, the children nobody named, the women nobody recognized. To walk through this story is to walk through corridors of darkness, where faith becomes fear, institution becomes prison, and memory becomes monster. In 2012, a documentary filmmaker petitioned St. Cecilia's and St. Augustine's Seminary for records of the 1887 ceremony. The church's response, no files found. The seminaries, allegations not within our purview. The orphanage building had been demolished, the bank boxes long purged. Instead of cooperation, institutional resistance rose. Public hearings were held in Beaumont's Landing, but testimony was minimal. Locals still feared to speak. The few surviving descendants of the plantation workers whispered, "The master's house always looked at us." The church offered a vague apology for past errors, but declined specifics. This confrontation reveals the real terror. Power structures that endure by erasing, resisting, deflecting. The forced wedding becomes emblematic of a system that uses religion, social welfare, and legal facade to perpetuate control. The barn, the orphanage, the seminary, they all colluded through silence. In the ruins of these institutions, we find the architecture of horror, not random, not supernatural, but built. Facing them means exposing not only one event, but a pattern of subjugation, forgetting, and closure. The viewer, hearing this story, becomes witness to betrayal by institution and land and faith. What does the story of Blackthorn Manor mean for our time? The forced marriage of Thomas to the three women, the silent children in the orphanage, the hidden archives, all resonate with modern themes: systemic erasure, institutional betrayal, the commodification of bodies and families. The barn remains in memory as a symbol of hidden coercion. The church bells that once authorized the spectacle now stand silent. The orphanage corridors, haunted by absence, mirror modern institutions that purport to help but also control. The land law masquerading as marriage signals how property and people intertwine still. Trauma that goes unacknowledged within families, in houses of worship, in seminaries, in state institutions grows roots. The three women symbolize those whose voices are erased. Thomas symbolizes the heir of power who cannot love. The town's forgetting stands for collective denial. The institutions refusing to release records reflect how our societies shield themselves from accountability. Exposing the story is an act of justice, not just historical, but moral. It demands that we recognize the ties between past and present, that we unveil how corruption, control, and ancient trauma are embedded in our systems, and that we remember when the world would rather forget. In the waning light of the levee, the remnants of Blackthorn Manor fade into reeds, but the story endures. The barn's skeleton, the orphanage's record, the forgotten names, Celeste, Rosamond, Inez, these are not myths. They are fractures in our memory, alarm bells in the night. The ritual in the town square was not an aberration. It was the result of architectural power rooted in land, church, estate. The true horror is not only what happened in 1887, but how generations were bound to silence. Tonight, I invite you, with measured breath, to carry this memory. To ask, what are the barns in our modern city? What are the institutions that demand marriage, compliance, control? Who are the three women whose names we do not even know? Who are the children who were forced into disappearance? By exposing this forgotten event, we do more than tell a story. We challenge the institutional machinery that hides such stories. We affirm that memory matters. We witness the trauma. We name the nameless. And in doing so, we reclaim a fragment of truth that no barn can bury, no church archive can erase. Remember that darkness hides not only beasts, but families, churches, seminaries, and towns complicit in forgetting.